Hello and welcome to another episode of Ossi Comments On, this time with Ancient Greece in 18 minutes, as you suggested. And my name is Ossi Isborn. I'm born in East Germany, raised and now living in Hamburg. I am a former history student without degree, and I am a former video game journalist. And even though I did study history, in my first two semesters, it was more Roman history. So I'm not an expert on Roman history, but even less so on Greek history. But I will try to learn with you together, as this is the pure goal of this channel, to learn together. That's why this is the knowledge enthusiast and not something else. That also means that maybe stuff I say here will be wrong. If it is, or if I think you need further explanation, then you have the info text box there, which will have any additional information, any clarification, and of course any correction that you can imagine. So without further ado, let's dig deep into the ancient Greeks. A civilization once prosperous, then declining, then prosperous again, then declining again, then part of the Roman Empire, then part of the Byzantine Empire, then part of the Ottoman Empire, then finally their own thing in middle of the 19th century, and now the brokest country in the EU, I think. But hey, they were once prosperous, and we now shall see why, when, and how it came to an end. While we should also make clear that pressing the spacebar while not on the window with the video will end the recording. So let's do that again and start the video proper. Oh yeah, by Arzamas.
We might think we already know everything about ancient Greece. The Parthenon, the 300 Spartans, and blind Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are familiar to all. Yet there were far more than 300 Spartans. The Parthenon was actually built as a kind of central bank, and no such unified state as ancient Greece with Athens as its capital ever existed.
I tend to disagree. I mean, yes, there was no united Greece until the shown here Alexander came around, but there was some kind of league system with Athens at its capital, which played a huge role in the Peloponnesian War, wars against Sparta, and had a lot of city-states in an alliance, paying tributes to Athens and financing their own sea fleet and stuff like that. So we could at least say there was some kind of predecessor. And then Alexander came around and unified everything. So that's that. And also the 300 Spartans, I think it's very clear now today that it was more than 300 men, and it wasn't only Spartans, and of course they all died. But in the end, it helped winning the war, even though the Persians would conquer much of Greece. Then were defeated on the sea by not only the fleet, but also by natural causes. And yeah, never forget that the Iliad and the Odyssey are two different stories, which loosely belong together. I mean, the Iliad is more or less the story we know because of the story of Troy, which centered around the Prince of Troy, Paris, more or less kidnapping the wife of Agamemnon's brother, whose name I forgot because I'm not that good with Greek names and everything Greek, because for me it all sounds the same and has complicated writing. But yeah, so Paris would kidnap the wife of Agamemnon's brother, or the soon-to-be wife, or something like that, flees with her to Troy. Agamemnon uses this as an excuse to wage war against Troy. And one of this war is about 10 years long. And in the last years, then King Odysseus from Ithaca, which is a small island on the west of Greece, has the brilliant idea of the Trojan horse, which then leads to Troy being conquered and burned down. While Paris is, I think, already dead, as well as Hector, his brother, and his younger brother then takes Helen of then Troy to his bride, and also dies, killed by another brother. It's a very complicated story if you have the full story and not the one in the movie with Brad Pitt. And the Odyssey is more or less the successor to the Ilias, and depicts said King Odysseus travels home from Troy. So he wants to go home from Troy, which is more or less on the west coast of modern day Turkey, near Izmir, and wants to sail home to Ithaca, which is not that far of travel even in those times. But the problem is that the sea god Poseidon is angry about him and sends him on some kind of mist travel, which leads all the way through the Mediterranean, so even to the Strait of Gibraltar, and fighting monsters, fighting cyclopes, fighting sirens, fighting some kind of evil witch that turned his men into pigs, and then arriving home as an old man in disguise because his wife was destined to marry again, even though all those that came to her would be repelled. And his own son is helping him, I guess, if I remember correctly. And then they together kill all the guys that made advances through to the wife, and then everyone lives happily ever after. And Homer is also said to have been blind, which kind of weakens your ability to write things. So actually, what modern science is debating is who was Homer, with more or less the conclusion that Homer never existed and is more or less more than one guy. So there was a couple of guys who wrote these stories and put them together, and no original Homer. But I think this is also debated. But I'm blabbering on too much here. Let's watch the video.
No such unified state as ancient Greece with Athens as its capital ever existed. The Trojan War was as distant in time to Alexander the Great as the Vikings are to ourselves.
If it happens.
So let's try to get our heads around ancient Greece, and hopefully a little quicker than in 2,000 years.
The Creto-Mycenaean era. Is that just they pressed the first people on Crete, and the Mycenaeans just slammed them together? Because there is no such thing as Creto-Mycenaean era. At least I never heard of it. It is always the Mycenaean era, which comes after the Minoan era, which is the culture that you know for the Minotaur and the Labyrinth and these fancy palaces on Crete, and the culture to where this belonged to, where the Minoa, in German it's Minoa, Minuans, I think in English, and the Mycenaeans were living in modern day Peloponnesia, I think. So the part of Greece, the is it is it a peninsula? I think it counts as a peninsula. It has a small land bridge near Athens. So yeah, the one with the three knives going down, or drops, or whatever you want to call them, or the one that looks like some giant dinosaurs stepped on Greece. This is the one I mean, and I think it's indeed a peninsula. I know it's connected by land, but I don't know if it still counts as a peninsula in that case, because like it is only like a few, maybe 2-3 kilometers wide. I don't know. I'm not sure how wide. I will put it in the info text box, for Christ's sake. But yeah, I never heard of Crete Mycenaean era. It's Mycenaeans and it's Minoans, and the Mycenaeans would conquer Crete, extinguish more or less the Minoans, but adapt their culture and adapt their alphabet, or not alphabet at that point, but you know what I mean.
And in 2,000 years. $3,716 years ago, the pyramids of Egypt were already standing, and Babylon was the world's first megapolis, home to a prototype of the Tower of Babel.
If it ever happened. I think the famous Tower of Babel is a story in the Bible, but there is no real evidence for it to ever existed. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on that. I think it's just biblical, and was damned by God, and then he made everyone speak in different languages.
Babylon was the world's first megapolis, home to a prototype of the Tower of Babel. On Crete, however, a mysterious civilization was flourishing. It had 3-storied palaces, and all this with no defenses. The Cretans apparently led a relatively peaceful life, admiring flowers, blue monkeys, and beautiful women, walked around topless, while the men preferred loincloths or skirts. The Cretans had a navy and their own writing system, and nobody has yet succeeded in deciphering them. Until one day, on the island of Thera, the modern-day wedding paradise of Santorini, all this ended in the greatest volcanic eruption in European history. Part of Thera sank beneath the waves, presumably giving rise to the myth of Atlantis. Tsunamis 100 meters high and vast ash clouds stretching for thousands of miles around.
Yeah, just imagine you're in this more or less prehistorical civilization. So, of course, this is long after the Stone Age, but it's still the early ages of where humans were still forming civilizations, and civilizations were popping up everywhere. But it's a very fragile state of being in. And then you have these massive volcanic eruption, which I'm not sure if it really happened. I think there's still some debate if it happened, but or they are sure, but they do not really know if it really did anything harmful to anyone in that sense. No, I'm just talking bullshit right here now. What I wanted to say is that just imagine this happening, and it was later described by one historian, I think, with the accounts of the end of Atlantis, the sinking of Atlantis. I don't remember which Greek guy it was. It was something with P, I guess, like Plato. Was it Plato, or Plutarch, or someone with P, I think, was it? And which is primarily the source we now have for Atlantis even existing. And it is believed that this volcanic eruption brought an end to it, as well as the Minoans. But as I said, it's also believed that the Minoans were ended by the Mycenaeans, which then adopted their cultures. So I'm unsure. I'm confused.
100 meters high and vast ash clouds stretching for thousands of miles around. Crete never recovered from this eruption, and invaders soon swarmed in.
Okay.
The once peaceful island then filled with bronze weapons and tablets written in a new, strange language, which turned out to be the earliest known form of Greek, spoken by warlike tribes, which had settled the nearby Greek mainland, building such cities as Thebes, Athens, Mycenae, and Pylos. But these cities already sheltered behind 6-meter walls. Life here was not peaceful at all. A few centuries later, the Greeks themselves explained them with legends of Cyclopean builders and were no longer aware that any other civilization had come before them on Crete.
Yeah, so the Minoans were conquered by the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans then adopted parts of their culture, inhabited maybe their palaces even, but then you had this linear A writing, and then you have linear B writing. So the Mycenaeans were also adopting the writing systems, but were changing it, and at some point everything was lost. So it is not like today that you have audio recordings, that you have video recordings, that you have written accounts from people living like 300, 400, 500, and even 1,000 years ago. Because I think almost at a later stage, almost no one could read linear A. They were only used to linear B, and even that will end with the Bronze Age collapse and the adaptation of the Phoenician writing, and which is vastly different than the Mycenaean or linear B and the Minoan or linear A. So a lot of the knowledge is lost, and the Mycenaeans will later on be vanished as well with the Bronze Age collapse, most likely to an invasion from other Greeks, or because of an invasion of the so-called Sea People, which are one of history's biggest mysteries, because no one knows where they come from, who they are. We just know about some sources, especially from Egypt, calling them sea people or people from the sea or outlander or stuff like that, which were or are partly in today's minds are partly responsible for the Bronze Age collapse and the downfall of many civilizations in the Mediterranean area. So yeah, the volcanic eruption just made them weak, but did not make them vanish. That's what I was going to. Okay, I just went ahead and looked it up with the volcanic eruption. So my misconception here was the date when this happened is disputed, but not the event itself. There's plenty of evidence that the event itself happened, because especially near the volcanic eruption, there was a Minoan city with city walls, by the way, which were 8 meters high, by the way. and covered in ash and stuff like that. So it is pretty clear that the eruption happened, but it is unclear when, because some say it was 1500 BC, one say it was 1600 BC to 1625 BC, which is what carbonite dating says, and the other thing is, I don't know. And fun side note, when I was looking that up, it seems that even that we don't even know if the of the Minoans, and even the name Minoans is derived from King Minos, which reigned on Crete at some point, and because until today Linear A has not been deciphered, and of course the civilization was lost way before any records could have been made. So there's that.
Had come before them on Crete. By this logic, even the half-bull Minotaur was half Greek. Nobody batted an eyelid at the fact that games with bulls were a purely Cretan form of entertainment. Greeks appropriated everything they met on their way with great virtuosity. In conquering Crete, they had conquered the seas. Marine trade saw them grow even richer. Almost all the inscriptions found among the heaps of gold in the tombs of Mycenae are financial accounts. Mycenae took the lead in the fight against Troy in Homer's Iliad. As recently as 150 years ago, this story was considered a fairy tale until a millionaire and amateur archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, excavated Mycenae and Troy.
At least, so Heinrich Schliemann, did excavate Mycenae, where it was said to have been, and Troy, where it was said to have been. And he actually found cities there. He found the cities of Troy, or what was called Troy, being burned down. But there's no let's say real evidence that this is indeed Troy, or that the Trojan Wars have indeed happened. As far as I remember, there are many city walls on top of each other, more or less, which indicates that the city was growing and was again and again reinforcing their city walls. Cities being burned down is very common practice in ancient warfare. So it is neither is it a proof nor is it a disproof. It is more or less roughly located where the Ilias depicted it, but we have to remember the Ilias or Iliad was written in like 800 BC, and the Trojan Wars were like 1300 BC, so at least 500 years in between, which means that if Troy really was destroyed, then it would have been very hard for like Homer or whoever wrote the Iliad to really locate it, because I don't think over 500 years, purely over mouth propaganda, this would have been kept alive with the exact location. And I don't know if there were written recordings, but with the Bronze Age collapse, which happened before the Iliad was written, like I said, Linear B got lost as well, and the time in between the downfall of the Mycenaean and the glorious times of Greek are also called the Greek Dark Ages, which derives partly from the fact that so much of the knowledge was lost. So let's say Schliemann found a city which could be Troy, but it is not 100% sure if it is Troy, and even if it is Troy, if the Trojan Wars ever happened. At least as they wouldn't have happened as depicted. It's a story. It's at least exaggerated, and yeah. But yeah, Heinrich Schliemann did excavate 2 cities.
Archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann excavated Mycenae, and Troy, a replica of the legendary Trojan horse, now stands here. Archaeologists have indeed found traces of fire and destructions at Troy, but this was accompanied by the decline of virtually all regional settlements. Unceasing attacks by barbarian tribes turned the whole Mediterranean into a war zone.
Yeah, the Dark Ages, which comes after the Bronze Age collapse, which is mostly... There are, I said in another video about the history of the entire world, I guess, by Bill Wirtz. I already talked about it. And so the Bronze Age collapse is still today. No one knows why it happened, what the causes were, and stuff like that. So all we know is it happened, and people switched from bronze to iron, and whole civilizations were gone from one day to another, more or less. Usually it is depicted like a mixture of natural catastrophes like volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods, with the previously mentioned sea people, which also no one knows where they come from and what they were. The rise of the Phoenicians, which is why then later the Phoenicians would, the Greeks would adapt the Phoenician alphabet, and the some outside force or other Greek force. So the Greeks themselves say that they were split into 4 collectivities, and one of them just waged war and destroyed the Mycenaeans, stuff like that. So it's still unsure, but raging war is just one of a few possible explanations, or one of a lot of possible reasons that could have happened at the same time or about the same time.
Into a war zone. The next 400 years were a dark age. Literacy fell into oblivion, leaving us with nothing to read about the events then taking place. Fortunately, what we do have is Homer. Everybody has heard about the blind poet, the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. In actual fact, we don't know what Homer looked like, or when he lived, whether he was one man or many. But even though the Iliad and Odyssey were written down after the Dark Ages, the daily routines of its characters take us right back to this time. Odysseus, for instance, was only king by virtue of his larger flocks of pigs and goats. His father slept on the ground in ashes with his slaves. Homer's characters were illiterate and used heads of cattle in place of money. A far cry from Crete and Mycenae with their 3-storied palaces.
And so, if any one of you has played Assassin's Creed Odyssey, then you know that you can visit Ithaca, and there is some kind of palace of the Odysseus, which most likely did never exist because he was more or less a poor king. He was a brilliant strategist, according to the Iliad at least, but he was not like a rich king with a gigantic palace or something.
A far cry from Crete and Mycenae with their 3-storied palaces. What had happened? The Mycenaean civilization was destroyed by the Dorians, who, though Greek, were totally savage. The earlier population either hid in the mountains or fled to the east. Of all the achievements of the previous civilization, the Dorians left only the essentials, the sailing ship and the potter's wheel.
But the Dorians, like I just said, this is just one theory. So actually, no one knows what exactly happened, what caused the Bronze Age collapse, what caused the more or less downfall or dark ages of Greece. Invading Dorians is just one explanation, which most likely the Greeks give themselves. So modern evidences actually found that this theory does not really hold true, because there's no evidence for it. There is except what the Greeks say themselves, there's no evidence of Dorian architecture, no evidence of Dorian weaponry or burials or anything like that. So it is still highly debated if this here depicted invasion actually ever happened.
In the mountains or fled to the east. Of all the achievements of the previous civilization, the Dorians left only the essentials, the sailing ship and the potter's wheel. It took a further 4 centuries for them to start adding the most primitive depictions of animals and people. At around the same time, the turn of the 9th and 8th centuries BC, the Greeks in Ionia borrowed a completely new alphabet from their Phoenician neighbors. This bore little resemblance to the linear writing styles of Crete and Mycenae. Do you recognize the modern Greek letters? The fog of Dark Ages had started to clear.
Yeah, so during the Dark Ages, Linear A was already gone. Then came Linear B, and in, what was it, 1700 BC or 1200 BC, something like that, it was lost. And then there were the Dark Ages, which lasted until roughly 800 BC, as depicted here, which brought the Phoenician alphabet back, or not back, to Greece. And in this time between, we almost have no records whatsoever, because of illiteracy, because of lost writing systems, because of maybe outside forces. There's more or less no records whatsoever. We know that there was time, because we know from the people that lived after that there was a time before, which does not add up with the time before we know, so there has to be some time in between. Also, we have some accounts of events during this time, but not many first-hand accounts, not many written accounts. So it's a little bit like the Dark Ages we had in Europe, in Central Europe, during the Middle Ages, because that's also a time where a lot of knowledge was lost out of a sudden, and at least to the people living in Central Europe and West Europe, and in this case as well. So those who were literate went for maybe the west coast of Turkey, or even further south to what is now Israel and stuff like that. And when they came back hundreds of years later, they had a complete new writing system, which was not compatible with the previous writing system of the region. Because that's why we don't know for sure what even happened.
Only here do we begin to recognize ancient Greece, the country that never actually existed. This was no state with an established border or capital, but rather a multitude of distinct and completely independent cities.
Not completely independent. So there are many accounts and many evidence for cities. Picture it a little bit like a feudal system. So you have maybe one big city, like, for example, Thebes and Athens and Sparta. And you have smaller cities in the areas around it. And because of power projection, these mightier, bigger, maybe more developed cities would have subsidiaries. So these smaller Greek cities would, to some degree, belong to a bigger city near them, would even maybe pay them taxes. They're not completely independent. At least that's what is believed today, and what I think I remember. I will put it in the info text box. But complete independency for all of the city-states is far stretched. And then we have, of course, the Spartans, who just conquered their surrounding areas and made them technically puppet states with where all the workforce, work labor was done. Labor force, that's what the word I meant. While they could concentrate on their army, as we all know.
But rather a multitude of distinct and completely independent cities, polises. How did this come about? Greece is a land divided by sea and mountains into separate little parts, of which only a handful was suitable for agriculture. Even grain had to be imported. But why not grow it yourself, over there, across the sea? Thus, the great colonization began. If the first historians are to be believed, Miletus alone founded 90 colonies. The heel of the Italian boot was colonized too, followed by the alphabet that would form the basis for Latin and take over the world. Greek civilization spread from the modern-day Rostov-on-Don to Marseille, laying the foundations of the French wine industry. Fragments of amphorae scattered from Gibraltar to Georgia. These were containers for grain and wine. The latter was diluted with water in proportions of 1 to 3. Oh.
Yeah, so we all know about the Roman Empire and how big it was, and how the complete Mediterranean was more or less in their pocket. A few centuries earlier, the Greeks actually did something similar. They were just not united, so it was not one continuous empire, but that's another part. There were city-states who made colonies. Some even made colonies within Greece itself, I think, and some, the most made colonies abroad, so where they could cultivate the area and make agricultural products, and would be less dependent on importing things like grain. And this is an idea that I think was then later copied by the Phoenicians, which then led to the foundation of Carthago, which then led to Carthago making their own colonies, which then led to the Romans burning down Carthago. But that's a story for another video, which will be the Roman one, I think.
For grain and wine, the latter was diluted with water in proportions of 1 to 3. Only barbarians would drink it neat. For trading purposes, coins appeared. Like the alphabet, these too were borrowed from their neighbors. According to Plato, a few centuries saw the Greeks settled around the Mediterranean like frogs around a pond. And yet, two cities, Athens and Sparta, almost did not participate in colonization. The Spartans descended from the warlike Dorians that had destroyed the Mycenaean civilization. They solved the land issue by conquering their neighbors in the broad, fertile region of Messenia. The locals were declared helots, something midway between slaves and serfs, and greatly outnumbered the Spartans proper. Sparta transformed from an ordinary polis into a military camp, whose main task was the prevention of any uprising.
Yeah, that's the devil's spiral of Sparta, so to speak, because Sparta was a kingdom or a city with sometimes two kings, or all the time two kings. I don't know for sure. but it was centered around warfare. Even Spartan wives would be included in these attempts of warfare, not as soldiers, but they were the ones giving birth to the future soldiers, and they were also believed to sacrifice those who were not worthy, to have their young boys thrown out in the wild and hope that they survive. So the training of a Spartan warrior was extremely brutal and extremely long. I think it took like to their mid-20s, and before they were seen as fully trained. And this army then was put to use by conquering neighboring territories, as I said earlier, and then make them slaves, or kind of slaves. And to prevent uprisings, you then have to give to have a more powerful army. So you need more recruits. So it wasn't only real Spartans who were in the army. So they would also recruit new people from around town, so to speak. And so the army grew. With a bigger army, you can conquer more territory. With more territory, you need a bigger army, and so on and so on and so on. So Sparta had to be concentrating 24/7 on warfare, just to not break away in rebellion. And on the other hand, did conquer ever more stuff and ever more people. Which means that they would have, because with the higher army, they need more people, because someone needs to feed the bigger army. So they need more people. So they need a bigger army. So they need more people, and so on and so on. And that's a very interesting dynamic. And I think it led in the end to the downfall of Sparta. But I'm not sure about that.
Into a military camp whose main task was the prevention of any uprising. Things were quite different in Athens. Land hunger there had forced the aristocracy and the people to come to terms, and from this, democracy was born. But first, the tyrants took power. A Greek tyrant did not necessarily terrorize people, rather the opposite. Typically, he was an aristocrat who had quarreled with his peers. Holding out promises of a better life, he used the common people's support to seize power by force. From then on, all his energies were focused on retaining power. The tyrant therefore made no reforms and simply drove any rival aristocrats from the polis. To divert the attention of the populace, tyrants introduced and fostered new festivals and cults. The dissatisfied could perish in the brazen bull.
Yeah. Tyrant is one of these words that are more or less misused today, as well as, for example, dictator. So a dictator in Rome was not necessarily a bad thing. People made it into becoming a bad thing, which then led to the modern languages viewing a dictator as something bad. The same for a tyrant. The same for empire. Empire in or imperio in Latin just means it wasn't even something about area. It was a title given to the person responsible for a specific area. Then later, this area was known as imperia, and then even later, imperium or imperia meant the whole realm that someone has power over. And then when the Holy Roman Empire started to decline and other empires arose, because for a long time the Holy Roman Empire was not only a empire, it was the empire, the only one. And then the term became the meaning that it has today of more or less a state that has puppet states, colonies, stuff like that, and a huge projection of power over them. But that's a far stretch from what it originally meant. The same for tyrant, the same for dictator, the same for so many other things, like democracy, is it in English? Sorry. Has a slightly different meaning in the time of Athens than it has today. But I think they will come to that later.
Polis. To divert the attention of the populace, tyrants introduced and fostered new festivals and cults. The dissatisfied could perish in the brazen bull. But you can't roast everyone. The tyrants were overthrown, and the suppressed aristocracy attempted to negotiate with the people, giving birth to Greek democracy. If an ancient Greek were to see modern democracy, he would just say one word: oligarchy. Ancient democracy was direct, with no representatives. If a polis had 6,000 citizens, they could all freely participate in the assembly.
Yeah, but at that point we have to stress that citizen only meant men, and only more or less wealthier men. So women, nope, they were not even counted as citizens. And a field worker would also not be counted as a citizen, which is maybe laid the foundation to what we know today as or what would democracy be for a long time. Voting rights for women are a very, very, very new thing. They're just 100 years old, in some areas even less, in some maybe more, but in most areas around 100 years old. So for all the rest of time, women were in most cases not allowed to vote. So were anyone else. So, and on top of that, like I just said, democracy has a different meaning today than it had at that time. At that time, democracy was from demos, or the people, and kresi, I don't know, I think kratos, like the god, which would then be the people. So it was the rule. So it was the rule of the people, and by people it was meant all, as he just said, all citizens. Whereas what we have today is what they would call an oligarchy, which is the rule of a few, which we then now call in if we use the official term, we don't even call it democracy today. We call it representative democracy, because in Switzerland, for example, you have a direct democracy, which means the people have some or more power over the government and over the laws that are made and over the politics than in other countries, which just elect an House of Representatives. For example, in Germany, it's the Bundestag, which then makes all these laws and decisions for you. Whereas in Switzerland, you do them directly, and you have petitions and public votes on a lot of topics. You still have a government which deals with stuff, but I think it's a happy mixture. But in ancient and democracy was not universal in all of the Greek or what later will become Greek realms. So, for example, Sparta was a monarchy, and later on the Macedonian Empire, or in that case the Macedon territory, was also ruled by a king. And I think Athens was more or less the first and one of only a few bigger democracies in ancient Greece. So it's not like we can equalize them all and say it's all the same all over modern Greece.
If a polis had 6,000 citizens, they could all freely participate in the assembly. Admittedly, the number of citizens was less than a quarter of all residents, excluding slaves, women, and the migrant workers called metics.
Mm-hmm.
By the middle of the 6th century, the Ionian cities were most advanced, eclipsing Athens and Sparta. They were the first to master such Eastern innovations as the alphabet, coinage, mathematics, naval fleets, and complex trade logistics. Meanwhile, a sudden threat appeared to their rear: the vast Persian Empire. Miletus still hoped to preserve its independence, and with Athenian aid, attempted to resist. Unfortunately, this was in vain, and the Persians torched the city and pressed on. Their attempts to subdue Greece lasted 20 years. We owe our knowledge of this to the first historian, Herodotus. According to his account, as many Greeks fought for the Persians as supported Athens and Sparta. How did they win? The first reason was military innovation. At the Battle of Marathon, the Greeks used the phalanx, a body of troops fighting in close formation.
Which also, I think, the what led to this battle was okay, let's start again. So you all know today that marathon is a term used for running 42 kilometers, or not running, but you know what I mean. It is said that it derives from a run from someone from Marathon to Athens to inform them that the Persians have arrived. And Athens and Marathon were said to be 42 kilometers apart. I will put the actual distance right there in the info text box. And this meant that the Athenians and their allies were ready ready for battle just in time, and way sooner than maybe expected from the Persians. It also is good to know that the Persians actually did try an invasion beforehand with most of their ships sinking in a storm or something like that. Then they made a second attempt, which is, I think, the one that with the Battle of Marathon, and all of that is the first Persian invasion. If I remember correctly, it will be a second, and the second one is the one with the 300 Spartans, which are not 300, but he will come to that, I think.
The Greeks used the phalanx, a body of troops fighting in close formation. The Persians allegedly lost 6,400 men, and the Athenians a mere 192, plus the messenger who ran the 42,192 meters to Athens to announce the victory.
This is actually a myth. It was thought up 500 years later by Plutarch. See? It was a myth. But it's still a cool story and still the origin for what we now call a marathon.
Who ran the 42,192 meters to Athens to announce the victory, after which he dropped dead. The second reason was already becoming a meme. At the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae, King Leonidas led the 300 Spartans, who held back hundreds and thousands of Persians for 3 days. Sure, a few thousand Greeks from other cities and their Helot subjects were a big help, yet the Spartan spirit was key. Not for nothing did they live in barracks, even during times of peace. And the third reason was the fleet. Several years prior to the invasion...
But, okay. So, yeah, the Persian Wars waged on for quite some time. I think it was more than 40 years. And there, as far as I remember, there were 2 invasion attempts, with the first one being repelled at Marathon and the second one being at least halted at Thermopylae. Thermopylae. The one with the 300 Greeks, the 300 Spartans, which in fact there were 300 Spartans and what was it, 1,700 from a neighboring city, and even some kind of 500 Athenians, stuff like that. But key to that success is, but I think you all know the movie, the memes and stuff like that. It's nothing new to you, but the Thermopylae are a very narrow path, and narrow path in history always led to defeats by those attacking, because even if you have the way much bigger force, you can just you can't push them all through. This is also why in some medieval battles you would open the gates to let the sieging forces in, because then they all have to come in through one gate. And you can defend this one gate easier than you could defend all the castle, and then you could stand maybe a siege. So your chances are better if you use a narrow point to negate any superior numbers, which is also what they did here. And then they were, at least that's what history tells us, someone who was not allowed to fight in the Spartan army, or a goat keeper of the area, then traded on the Spartans and revealed a pathway to the Persians, which they could use to get on the rear or behind the Spartans, which then led to them being encircled and killed. A pathway which the Persians would have found anyway at some point. I mean, it's not like this was a state secret and hidden with leaves and stuff like that. I'm sure they would have found it anyway. So, yeah. And yeah, there were like 2,000 to 3,000 men against a way much bigger army, not millions as depicted in the graphic novel or the movie, but still a huge army.
Peace. And the third reason was the fleet. Several years prior to the invasion, silver deposits had been found near Athens. This windfall might have been spent on anything, but it was decided to put it towards the construction of 200 triremes, fast and maneuverable warships with 3 rows of oars. Thanks to this new naval force, the Greeks broke the Persians in a decisive naval battle. A counter-offensive began. The Greeks of Sicily defeated their old rival, Carthage. A scattered array of polises thus defended the territory in which classical Greek culture was born. To permanently defeat Persia and liberate the cities in Asia, Athens founded a maritime union. Finally, Athens had become the center of the Greek world.
That's what I meant earlier, this union. And all these smaller states within the union would pay tributes to Athens, or would conscript personnel that Athens then could use if a war would break out, and stuff like that. So Athens was more or less the capital of this union. But because of this union becoming a major threat, I think that's what then led to the Peloponnesian Wars, or they were started by Athens, some kind of stuff like that, but I think we will learn about it now.
A maritime union. Finally, Athens had become the center of the Greek world. 150 cities agreed to make annual payments for the maintenance of a common army and navy. The treasure was kept on Delos, the sacred island of Apollo. Shortly afterwards, however, patronage was passed to Athene, motivated by greater fiscal reliability, of course. Little imagination is required to suppose which polis was chosen for her headquarters. The most elite real estate in the 5th century BC was the Parthenon. It was constructed not so much as a temple, but as a kind of central bank, housing all the Allied treasury. Without these funds, the Greek classics wouldn't have existed at all. No sculpture, drama, philosophy. The strategist and orator Pericles became the head of this new financial center.
But it was also seen as a temple, I think, so it was used in both senses. So, and we have to bear in mind that this whole complex here, this mountain that still is in Athens today, as we all know, that's the Acropolis, and this temple on top, that's the Pantheon. And the Pantheon was constructed as a temple, and then later on used as not only a temple, but it was constructed as what's that here? Something's loading. Okay, it was constructed as a thank from the Athenians to their protective goddess Athene, as a thank you for helping them in the Persian Wars, and then used as a treasury chamber. And Pericles was actually the first real, more or less democratic leader of Athens. Because the democracy, which we were learning about earlier, was not yet a real defined thing. It would only become its own thing with the Attic democracy, which is more or less founded and led by Pericles. Yeah, so that's that.
The strategist and orator Pericles became the head of this new financial center. He concluded a 30 years peace with Sparta, restored the Acropolis that had been sacked by the Persians, and extended fortress walls to the city harbor. This was rebuilt to a grid layout, a forerunner to New York. While the sculptor Phidias was immortalizing Greece in stone, the philosopher Anaxagoras expressed an outrageous idea that the sun was not the god Hellas, but a burning body equal in size to Peloponnese.
Okay. And these 30 years peace with Sparta actually only lasted 20 years, 15 years. It would never last 30 years because of the previous mentioned Peloponnesian Wars, which will break out and see Athens and Sparta fight against each other way before the end of this 30-year peace. And yeah, that's also the time, the more or less golden age of Greek cities and Greek philosophy, Greek ideas, Greek sciences. With around this time, it was when people found out that the Earth is round, and they even found out that the sun is not a god, as we just learned, but a body in the sky, which that was still the belief at that time, is revolving around the Earth, as well as the moon and all the other stars, and even the circumference of the Earth was measured at that time using the sun. Then you have Greek philosophy with many enlightened ideas, and I use the word enlightened to stress that Greek philosophers would. So we all know about Greek mythology, about Greek gods. And Greek scientists and Greek philosophers despised more or less the idea of gods. They were against deities, against theist ideas. They were as what we would call enlightened later on in our own modern times. And these Greek philosophers also, so what we call today philosophy in Greek times was more or less just talking. It was like the Socrates, one of the greatest philosophers of them all, was annoying to all the people around him, because he just wouldn't shut up, and he questioned everything, so much so that everyone just he was getting on everyone's nerves. No one wants to talk with him because they knew no matter what they say, he will question it. And that, my friend, is called philosophy. Just there are some accounts that even say that Socrates was stupid in that sense, because instead of arguing, he just questioned. You could say to him, like, now the sun is not a god, and then he would say, "Isn't it?" So he leaves you to explain. That's not a discussion. He was not a great man for discussions. He would just question everything, annoy everyone. Then we have another great Greek philosopher, Diogenes, I think was the name, which is the father of what do you say in English? Cynicism. And in reality, he was just a man who lived. He was homeless, lived in a barrel. Sometimes not even that, because he thought that even that would be too much of luxury. There is a story about him that even Alexander the Great would visit him and would just be insulted by him. Then the famous story with when the scientists were starting to define what a human is, and he just said, yeah, and the opinion was, it is a featherless biped, so no feathers on two legs, that's a human person. And then Diogenes would go on, rip a chicken of all its feathers, present it to the science class and say, look here, a human person. So there you have it. That's your great Greek philosophers, annoying and poor homeless guys. Today, this is like saying that you go to your city center and there's someone crying that the world is going to end in 2 days, and the usual people we would call crazy, and then you would go on and say, no, this person isn't crazy, it's a great philosopher. And that's what the Greek did in the end.
Was not the god Helus, but a burning body equal in size to Peloponnese. A whole great culture was created in half a century. Sparta and its allies grew jealous of Athens' prosperity. A cold war had smoldered between them ever since the victory over the Persians, and things warmed up in 431 BC. The Spartans and their allies besieged impregnable Athens. Its inhabitants took cover behind the walls. The grain supply from Africa was cut off, and those shipments that made it through brought either typhus or the plague. Even Pericles himself perished. He was replaced by demagogues. Whoever promised the most was elected strategist.
The Peloponnesian War, I think I was wrong earlier, and it actually was provoked by Athens, and I think not even with the Spartans, but with, I think, Carthago, and then just the Spartans would join in and lay siege on Athens, but I'm not entirely sure.
Replaced by demagogues. Whoever promised the most was elected strategist. So Alcibiades, the unscrupulous nephew of Pericles, became the head of the Athenian armed forces. He proposed a short but victorious war. Let's pack it all in and sail for Sicily, as if the altercations with Sparta weren't enough. The fleet was ready, but something inexplicable happened the night before the voyage. All around the city, someone smashed off the most prominent parts of the Hermes statues. Alcibiades was accused of provocation, but he fled to Sparta to beg political asylum.
Wait, isn't Alcibiades the one in Assassin's Creed Odyssey who is boinking goats? Isn't that him? That's all I know about him.
He was accused of provocation, but he fled to Sparta to beg political asylum. The chief strategist then proceeded to advise the enemy. The allies began to drop out one by one. Athens agreed to a humiliating peace with the condition of demolishing its defensive walls. They had targeted Hermes, and the might of Athens was crushed. On the bright side, this was the heyday for Greek tragedy and comedy. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the three great tragedians, and the comedic playwright Aristophanes created plays that are still relevant today.
Yeah, for example, Sophocles wrote the famous play of the Theban king Oedipus, which was sent away from his home by the king of Thebes because the oracle of Delphi said to him that one day his son would kill him and then boink his wife. So they did not want to let this prophecy come true, sent the young boy Odysseus away with a sheep herder, which then meets another sheep herder and gives him the child, who then brings it back to, I don't remember the city, but another king who raises the child as its own. And then one day, the old king of Thebes would meet his son Odysseus in a small valley or a small pathway, and which is not wide enough for both of them. And they have an argument about who should make space, so to let the other through. Over which Odysseus kills then his father, which is part one of the prophecy come true. And then he learns that he is not originally the son of the person who he thought was his father, goes to the oracle of Delphi, gets the same prophecy as his father got, and then goes to Thebes, which is besieged by a sphinx, because a sphinx is not only the thing in Egypt in front of the great pyramids of Gizeh, it's actually some kind of goddess. I don't know if goddess is the right word. It's like unicorns for us are today. So it's a mythical creature, and the Sphinx has a riddle for him. The old famous riddle: what has two legs, 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at midday, and 3 legs in the evening. And Odysseus is actually solving this ancient puzzle, and then the Sphinx. That's a tongue breaker with what a tongue breaker. Mr. Sphinx then refuses to come true to his promise of leaving the city alone, which is devastated by the terror that Mr. Sphinx brought upon them. And so yes, Odysseus comes to Thebes because they want to get rid of the of Mr. Sphinx, and something like that. No, cut me some slack. And then they have an argument, and then the Sphinx falls down some trench and is dead. And Odysseus is celebrated as the one bringing down Mr. Sphinx, and declared or proclaimed to the new king, and marrying the queen widow, which, as we all know by now, is his mother. And so on and so on and so on. That's the most famous play from Sophocles, I think. Maybe he has an even more famous play, but that's the one. What we also have to know, in the in Great Britain, like William Shakespeare's tragic plays would only be played by men, because women were not allowed to play any roles in theater. And this tradition actually started more or less here in Greece, because in Greek theater, all roles as well were played by men, and women weren't even allowed to attend. So all the Greek tragedies, all the amphitheaters, all for women, all for men, because women had no rights. Women were, especially in Athens, not even allowed to leave the home without the permission of her husband or father or whoever is the patriarch of the family. So that much for equality.
Playwright Aristophanes created plays that are still relevant today. And yet they penned them in the full confidence that the first production would be the last, as was the way in theatre at the time. Classical drama was always about current events, and while things may have been getting worse in the city, culture flourished.
The Great Age.
There was no winner in the Peloponnesian War. All Greek cities fell into decline. On the other hand, unexpected surprises would come from the Macedonians, distant relatives of the Greeks who had always been regarded as semi-barbarians. And then even the great philosopher Aristotle went to work in Macedonia as tutor to an extremely talented boy. The boy's father was Philip II. It was he who built up the Macedonian kingdom.
So this now is the age of unification of Greece in some sense. And of course, the great wars that Alexander would wage.
His father was Philip II. It was he who built up the Macedonian kingdom, defeating a Greek coalition. He almost managed to unite Greece in order to fight the Persians. But Philip was killed, and his son, known to us as Alexander the Great, blazed his way through Asia, broke the army of the Persian king Darius, but still refused to turn back, reaching India. Thus, a new world was born, the Hellenistic world.
So Alexander the Great, first, when he came on the throne, when his father was killed, he was 20 years old, which even at that time is pretty young to be king. But he was a great he was a great king, in the sense that first he brought the Macedonian kingdom, which was in unrest. He calmed them and he united them, and then he united the Greek city-states, and then with their combined forces, he went on to wage war with the Persians, with Egypt, and then later on going all the way to India. And this was not many separate conquests. This was one solid conquest, with the founding of many cities, like at least 20 or so Alexandrias. The most famous one would later be in Egypt, and one named after his horse Bukios or something like that. And so he marched on and on and on, and in every those cities he would leave the soldiers behind who would have been injured or sick or for some reason couldn't march on further. And he went on and on and on and on and on. And at some point he reached India and he wanted to go even further. At this point, the campaign lasted for like 6 years or so. And his men just wanted to be back home, to go back home. But he still pushed them through to even conquer more because Alexander was never defeated in battle and he wanted to have the greatest empire the world has ever seen. And in some sense, he wanted to be the emperor of the world. So he would have never stopped unless he would reach the sea. But on some point, within the thick jungle of India or the mountains of India or somewhat like that, his men started to mutiny and they just said, no, we will not go any further. We have to go back. Alexander did not accept that, but without an army he can't fight. So then he led them back. But not without founding another Alexandria where he then put some people there to stay there. So even if anyone wanted to go home, they would not. Then he married in Persia, and then he died at 32 or something. So his reign was really short, but it unified Macedonia, it unified Greece, it had the greatest empire that the world has ever seen to that point, but it won't last. A little bit like later on with Genghis Khan.
In India, thus a new world was born, the Hellenistic world. Greek and Eastern culture blended to form a new whole, as cities by the name of Alexandria sprang up in almost every land, though without any democracy. All officials in Asia spoke Greek, and new Oriental gods became neighbors with the old Greek ones at Mount Olympus. Alexander was proclaimed a god himself in Egypt. Protocol obliged all to follow Eastern tradition and fall at his feet. We can only wonder at how this might have ended. Greek decrees have been found urging the spread of Buddhism, but Alexander died young. Babylon, the place of his death, had become the capital of an empire, which immediately began to crack at the seams.
Yeah. The empire was then split with his generals, everyone being the new regent in their specific region. I'm not entirely sure if they fall into disagreement right away or if this was an intentional split. A bit like later on that would be in Rome with splitting to West and Eastern Rome and have two capitals and have two emperors, or if it was just dissolved or something. And the most famous one maybe of these generals would be Ptolemy, which then would lay the foundation for the Ptolemean dynasty in Egypt, which then would end with Cleopatra in from that point on, like about 300 more years. So it was a good dynasty,
which immediately began to crack at the seams. While the successors of Alexander warred with one another, a new ambitious power was growing in the West. In 146 BC, the Romans conquered Greece, and in 30 BC, they conquered the last stronghold of Hellenism, Egypt. But Greek culture was victorious even here. Spread by the Romans, it finally conquered the world. Romans began to read the Iliad and Odyssey in Greek, followed by the Greek New Testament too. In 330, Emperor Constantine built a new city on the site of the old Greek colony of Byzantium. Constantinople. This was the starting point for the history of the Byzantine Empire, which extended the life of Greek culture another 1,000 years, leaving us the weird Russian alphabet, for instance. Did you like our video? We have another one, this time about ancient Rome. Or you can watch the shortest history of Russian art of the 20th century. We've squeezed 100 years into just 25 minutes. And that's not all. Subscribe to the Arzamas channel, and you'll be sure not to miss out anything.
100 years in 25 minutes, that's nothing. I just squeezed 17 or almost 18 minutes in, what are we now at? 1.5 hours or so. So, yeah. We are, the Greek history is a very, very interesting one. We have still today many influences of Greek culture and even Greek words like democracy and like theater and stuff like that. All that derives from Greek, which was later used in the Roman Empire. And despite the Greeks not having an empire like the Romans did, not that much direct influence on the regions like on the European regions like the Romans did, they still had their indirect influence. They still had their huge influence in the then former Persian Empire, even parts of India, even parts of Egypt for a brief period of time, and with Alexander. Or so the Greek culture goes all the way back to, what was it now, 3000 BC, and only the last like 400 years would see, or no, 300 years would see real Hellenistic rule in all these territories, which then somewhat dissolves into the Roman culture, becoming one. So Romans were really good in adapting cultures. This is why many of our Christian holidays, for example, fall on dates that were previously heidnic or heretic, or whatever you say in English, non-believing or other believing festivities. So they would be more likely to accept the new religion. And the same, they love the Greek arts. And as we all know, the southern part of Italy and Sicily were Hellenistic and had their interaction with the with Rome, and then the Roman Empire was long lasting, with a lot of time on adopting even more cultures. They did not only adopt the Greek culture and helped spreading it, they helped spreading and adopting other cultures as well. So like I said, the indirect influence the Greeks had over Europe, and therefore more or less the whole world, is still amazing, and it's still a great culture. Even though I am again and again blasted by how little I really know about Greek history and Greek culture and stuff. So I know some little parts. I know of Alexander the Great and his conquests and stuff like that. I know about mythology and plays, but not really about all that was going on around. So maybe in the future I will dig deeper into Greek history and watch some other videos, but not now, because now this video has an end. Stay tuned for the next video that will be on the Second World War by Oversimplified, and stay also tuned for, of course, we will do Ancient Rome in 20 minutes, and this will be in in a short while. If you watch this video in the future, then it may be already be published, so you can just wait a few seconds now and then go to the cards and just click on the link. So anyway, I thank you for watching. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. You'll find the link to the original video in the description. If you don't like, please dislike and tell me why, if you are so nice. And tell me what you think. Tell me what video do you want to see next or in the future. And yeah, with that, I wish you a good night and have a nice evening and stay fun. Bye bye.